I stood on the soaked wooden porch of my childhood home, feeling the rain slide cold down the back of my neck as my stepmother's fingers twisted violently into the collar of my uniform jacket. Her face was inches from mine, breath sharp with the bitterness I remembered too well. "You are a stray," I picked up. "Be grateful I do not hit you more." She screamed it into my face with a force that sent a shock through my entire body, the kind that hits a soldier harder than recoil because it is not an enemy on foreign soil. Saying it. It is family, or what is left of something pretending to be family. The sky over Spring Lake was turning a deep slate gray, the kind of Carolina storm that makes the air heavy and electric, but Linda's voice cut through it with a cruelty that felt personal and practiced. Before I could steady my stance, she shoved me hard. My boots slipped on the wet boards, and I hit the porch on one knee, a sharp jolt running up my thigh. The belt in her other hand swung upward in a quick threat. She did not need to strike me. The intention alone pulled me back into years I had fought so long to escape. "I should have hit you harder when you were a kid." The words came out like an old habit, almost casual, almost bored, as if she had rehearsed them so many times that cruelty had become routine. Behind her, my stepbrother Derek leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a smirk tugging the side of his mouth. He was enjoying it. He always had. That smirk had followed me through adolescence like a shadow. "A soldier who cannot even keep her own house in order," he said under his breath, just loud enough for the neighbors on their porches to hear. I lifted my eyes and caught two of them staring before quickly turning away. They never helped. They never wanted to get involved. Linda tightened her grip on my jacket and yanked me back to my feet with surprising strength. She jabbed her finger into my chest. "You think you get to come back here after your father is gone and pretend you have rights. You have nothing. You are nothing." Her voice rose again sharp enough to cut through thunder. "You are not his daughter. You were never his daughter. You do not get this house." She pulled a crumpled envelope from her pocket and waved it inches from my face. "I will take this to court. I will make sure everyone knows you threatened me." I heard the words, but what hit me harder was the realization that she had already moved her pieces, already filed something, already poisoned the narrative. My stomach dropped as a cold wave of recognition hit me. She was not screaming to intimidate me. She was screaming to perform, to set the stage, to trap me into reacting so she could claim I was unstable, a problem soldier, a danger. The rain grew heavier and pooled at the edge of the porch. My reflection flickered in it for a moment, the captain rank on my collar catching a faint shimmer of light. I had jumped out of planes at night, led platoons through training that broke stronger people than Derek would ever be, briefed senior officers without shaking. But somehow standing here with Linda's spit hitting my cheek, I felt 11 years old again, scared, cornered, and small. "Say something, Rowan. Defend yourself. Hit back." It echoed in my mind like a drill command, but my training held the line. Responding was exactly what she wanted. I straightened slowly, brushed off my knee, and pulled my jacket gently out of her grip. I saw the flicker of frustration cross her face. She hated when I stayed calm. Derek stepped forward and laughed quietly, almost impressed. "Look at her trying to act like a real officer." Linda lifted the belt again in a sharp motion meant to make me flinch. I refused to give her that satisfaction. "If someone screamed that in your face, what would you do?" Her eyes narrowed. "Get off my property, stray. You have no place here." My father's tools boxes, papers, the last pieces of him were inside that house, and she knew it. She knew exactly how to place the knife and twist. I turned away because staying would give her the reaction she came outside to collect. The storm wind hit me full in the face as I stepped off the porch. Rain washed down my jaw where her words had burned. I made it halfway down the driveway before my phone vibrated. "Unknown number," I answered out of instinct. "This is Captain Hale." The voice on the other end was steady and official. "Captain Hale, this is headquarters. A complaint has been filed regarding a family misconduct incident. We need you to report in first thing tomorrow." My pulse stalled. She had beaten me to the first strike. And this time, the battlefield was my career. I was 11 the summer Linda first stepped into our house in Spring Lake, carrying a smile so sweet it made the air feel heavy. I remember the exact moment she looked at me. Not with curiosity or warmth, but with calculation, as if she were assessing a stray animal someone had forgotten to chase off the porch. She placed her hand on my father's arm nails, tapping lightly, and said she hoped I would not be too much trouble. I did not understand the warning then, but I learned it quickly. The first week she lived with us, she rearranged the entire house. My room shrank. Her son, Derek, got a new desk, a new bed, fresh posters at the window that caught the morning light. I was moved to the smaller bedroom in the back, the one with the draft that crept under the door in winter. She said it suited me. I did not realize she meant it literally until she began calling me things that were not my name. Burden, stray, extra mouth. I tried to brush it off because Dad would laugh awkwardly and say Linda was just joking, but the jokes grew shifting shape until they became the language of the house. She used them when I misplaced a shoe or forgot to shut a cupboard. Derek repeated them during dinner. Even Dad slipped once and said burden without noticing. Every time Linda passed me in the hallway, she angled her body like she needed more space, like I should flatten myself against the wall so she would not be inconvenienced by my existence. She told guests that Derek was her son and that I was her husband's daughter from a previous mistake. She said it with a soft laugh and people smiled politely, pretending not to hear the acid underneath. My world shrank from the size of a house to the size of my bedroom doorway. I spent afternoons sitting on the floor back against the bed frame, staring at the wall and wondering how a home could turn so cold, even during a Carolina summer. The only time I felt I could breathe was at school. When I turned 13, my guidance counselor suggested I try ROTC. I signed up because the uniform looked sharp and because it meant I could stay after school longer. The first time I stood in formation, shoulders squared, chin up feet, rooted exactly where they belonged, something inside me loosened. For the first time in years, the air around me did not feel hostile. Captain Drayton, our instructor, looked us in the eyes when he spoke and expected us to stand like we mattered. He corrected my posture only once. After that, he nodded at me with quiet approval every time we marched or drilled. At home, Linda rolled her eyes at my uniform, said it made me look like a child pretending. When I came home late from practice, she made comments about how a stray should not have so much freedom. If I left my boots near the door, she pushed them aside with her foot, like garbage. When I brought home ribbons from competitions, she taped Derek's artwork over them on the fridge. Dad watched, but rarely intervened. Whenever I told him she made me feel unwelcome, he sighed and said she was adjusting that being a stepmother was hard, that I should try harder to get along. I learned then what defeat looked like on a grown man. He loved her more than he loved peace. I grew during those years taller and stronger, and my voice changed from a timid whisper to something firmer. But the house did not change. The labels stuck to me like damp air. During dinner, Linda would talk about Derek's grades, Derek's leadership potential, Derek's future college choices. Then she would turn to me and ask whether I had finished my chores or if I planned to keep being a burden well into adulthood. If I flinched, she smiled like she had scored a point. The smallest hope I held was that Dad would notice the way she chipped at me piece by piece. But he had grown quieter with time, shrinking into himself, nodding when she spoke, retreating into silence when she lashed at me. I think he was afraid of losing her. I think he was tired of choosing between us and always choosing wrong. My high school years passed with the same rhythm. School was escape, home was survival. ROTC became sanctuary. When we practiced ruck marches in the cold morning fog behind the school, the sting in my lungs felt clean compared to the sting of Linda's words. When I learned discipline and structure, it felt like oxygen. I kept my grades high even though Derek mocked me for studying. I ignored him. I stayed late whenever I could, tutoring younger cadets or cleaning equipment because staying at school meant not being at home. The day I turned 17, I sat on the bleachers after practice and realized I could leave. Not temporarily, not for a weekend, for good. The Army had become the only place where I felt seen, not as a stray or an inconvenience, but as someone with use and worth. I filled out enlistment paperwork that afternoon with my guidance counselor watching. When I brought the forms home, Linda laughed and said the Army could have the burden she never wanted. Dad stared at the table and did not argue. His silence that night felt like the final crack in something already broken. Leaving home after graduation was the closest thing to breathing freely that I had ever felt. But even freedom carries ghosts. The labels Linda carved into me followed into basic training. Sometimes when a drill sergeant shouted, I heard her voice layered beneath his. Sometimes when I folded my uniform or checked my equipment, I remembered the countless times she had shoved my belongings aside. But I pushed forward because the Army gave me something she never did. A way out. A path. A chance to build a life where my name meant something again. And though I became a captain respected by soldiers and seniors alike, part of me always knew the past had not finished with me. I just never expected it to strike back in the exact tone of Linda's voice. By April of 2024, my life at Fort Liberty ran with the clean rhythm of a machine that had taken years to build. Every morning before the sun even thought about lifting over the pines, I was already lacing my boots with the familiar tug that grounded me in the present. Physical training began at 05:30 as always. The air was still cool then, carrying that faint Carolina dampness that settled on the skin without soaking it. My company fell into formation the moment I stepped onto the field. Even half awake, they straightened the second they saw me. Captain Hale. It was a title that carried weight here in a way nothing at home ever had. I called cadence as we jogged the perimeter and listened to their footsteps echo against the asphalt. Sometimes during those runs, I caught myself thinking about how strange it was that on base I was respected almost instinctively. A nod from soldiers passing by. A morning ma'am from lieutenants still trying to find their footing. A salute crisp enough to cut through fog. Yet 10 minutes from here in Spring Lake, my stepmother could still look at me like I was less than nothing. It was the contrast that never stopped scraping at me. On Thursdays, we had airborne refresher training. I had gone through hundreds of jumps since joining the division, but the ritual never lost its hold. The harness tightening across my shoulders. The heavy thud of boots on the aircraft floor. The moment the jumpmaster's hand slapped your shoulder and the wind tore at everything that tried to hold you down. I used to think falling through the night sky would make me feel small. Instead, it made me feel free in a way I had not known existed when I was a child standing in Linda's doorway. After morning PT and chow, the day shifted into meetings and briefings. As a company commander, I reviewed readiness reports, personnel concerns, and training schedules. I worked closely with Major Elise Branford, the battalion XO. She was the kind of leader who carried authority without needing to raise her voice. Her presence steadied a room. She had been the first to notice when I started coming in more tense than usual after my run-ins with Linda, though I never told her the full truth. Elise was sharp enough to read between silences. She once pulled me aside after a meeting and said quietly that strong people sometimes come from places that tried to break them. She left it at that. She did not pry. That was why I trusted her more than almost anyone. First Sergeant Keller was the other anchor in the unit. He was direct, thick-shouldered, and the only person who could silence a rowdy platoon with one look. He kept a close watch on the younger soldiers, made sure no one slipped through the cracks, and never tolerated disrespect. Keller had a quiet respect for me that you could feel in the way he addressed me. Not exaggerated, not performative, genuine. If something threatened my soldiers, he handled it before I even had to ask. If someone tried to undermine my authority, he shut it down. He once told me a good company needs a commander with backbone and a senior NCO who makes sure that backbone stays unbent. That was our rhythm. My days were often long. I went from airborne operations to field training planning to counseling sessions with soldiers who were struggling. Military life demanded everything all at once, and I did not mind. The weight of responsibility felt steady compared to the chaotic weight of the Hale household I grew up in. Soldiers came to me with problems, and I listened. They trusted me with their stories, their worries, their mistakes. I treated them with fairness because I remembered too well what it felt like to be dismissed. The Army taught me to lead, but it also taught me to breathe. On base, I was useful and needed. Off base, I was tolerated at best and insulted at worst. It was not unusual that during quiet moments between meetings, I felt the past creeping back around me like an old bruise. Sometimes a private would knock softly on my office door and say they needed help with a family situation. The moment they said family, my stomach twisted in a way I hoped never showed on my face. I always told them the same thing. You deserve to be treated with respect everywhere you stand. If you are giving the world your best and someone still calls you less than you are, that is their failing, not yours. I meant the words even when I struggled to believe them for myself. At the end of each day, I walked back to my quarters in the quiet evening air. The sky over Fort Liberty turned soft gold before it sank into darker blues. Soldiers drifted across the pathways, some laughing, some heading to chow, some lost in their own thoughts. It always struck me how different these faces were from the ones I grew up with. These people saw value in me long before I saw it in myself. So it was almost surreal that the same woman who could command a company of paratroopers respected across the division was being dragged back into the shadows of a home that never wanted her. Sometimes I stood in my small kitchen at night, polishing my boots or reviewing training notes, and I would hear Linda's voice in some deep corner of my memory. Stray, burden, second class. It was bizarre how childhood cruelty lingered even when adulthood demanded strength. You can fit in perfectly everywhere else and still be the outsider in the one place that should have protected you. I had grown into someone capable, responsible, and calm under pressure, yet none of it mattered at that small house 10 minutes away. And that friction, the one between Captain Hale and the girl Linda tried to break, was the fault line that trembled beneath everything that would come next. Have you ever been respected everywhere except inside your own home? The notification from headquarters stayed in my mind long after I hung up the phone. A complaint, a misconduct report. Someone had already written a narrative about me before I ever had the chance to speak, and there was only one person who would move that fast and strike that deliberately. Linda. She had always known where to hit. I stood in my quarters that night, uniform jacket still damp from the rain, staring at my reflection in the narrow bathroom mirror. A captain in the 82nd Airborne. Someone trusted to lead soldiers through danger. Someone who had jumped into darkness without hesitation. And now, because of Linda's performance on that porch, I was suddenly a suspect in a family incident that did not exist. The next morning, I reported to headquarters at 0700. The review officer on duty informed me that a case had been opened by CID, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. My stomach tightened at the words. CID did not open files over petty arguments. They investigated serious misconduct, abuse, threats, violence. Violent after deployment, the complaint alleged. Unstable, a danger to family members. The phrases were printed in neat black text on the form like facts, but every line felt like a lie scraped from Linda's tongue. I sat in a small office with walls the color of cooled cement while the review officer explained the process. Standard procedure. Nothing to panic about, just clarifying facts. CID would send someone to speak with me. They would speak with the complainant as well. They would gather evidence. It was his calmness that made it worse. My hands stayed still in my lap, but inside me everything felt shaken. The moment I stepped out into the hallway, Major Elise Branford was standing there with her arms folded. She had heard. Word traveled fast in a battalion. She studied my face for a few seconds before she spoke. Is any of this grounded in truth? I shook my head. She nodded once. Then, brace. CID asks questions, not judgments. But they ask hard ones. Do not let her get into your head. I wanted to say she already had, but I just nodded. At 1500 hours, the CID interviewer arrived, a lieutenant named Carson, younger than me by a few years, but composed, carrying a notebook and a neutral expression that made it difficult to read what he was thinking. We sat in a private room with no windows, only a table between us. He started with simple questions. Where had I been on the day of the alleged incident? Why had I gone to Spring Lake? Did I have contact with my stepmother during recent weeks? Did I have a history of emotional instability after deployment or training? I answered each question carefully, truthfully. I told him I had gone home to collect old paperwork belonging to my father. I told him Linda had interpreted my visit as trespassing. I told him she had shouted at me. I told him she had shoved me. I did not tell him about the belt she swung for effect. I did not tell him how her words scraped over old wounds like sandpaper. I answered only what was necessary. Carson took notes without looking at me. He never reacted. He did not give reassurance or concern. CID investigators dealt in facts, not comfort. Then he slid a printed sheet across the table. It was a screenshot from Facebook. My chest tightened before I even read it. It was a post from Derek on the neighborhood group page. I am worried about Captain Rowan Hale. She returned from deployment acting unstable, yelled at my mom, threatened her, broke things. We are scared for our safety. Does anyone know who to contact on base? There were comments beneath it. Sympathy for Linda. Concern for Derek. Speculation about PTSD. Rumors twisting into stories. Stories twisting into conclusions. The kind that take on a life of their own if you do not kill them quickly. My throat tightened as I stared at the page. I had jumped from aircraft in the middle of the night without fear, but this quiet dismantling of my character felt like falling without a chute. Carson studied my face, finally showing a trace of human reaction. You understand why we have to look into this. This is not nothing. I nodded, though the words sat like lead in my stomach. When the interview ended, I walked out into the sunlight, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me. Rumors were dangerous in civilian life, but in the military they were grenades. A whisper could become a red flag. A red flag could become an evaluation note. An evaluation note could become the end of a career. And Linda knew this. She had always known where to apply pressure, how to twist weakness into leverage. Only this time she had found a weapon that could reach into the one area of my life she had never been able to poison before. I headed back toward the company office and saw Keller leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with the steady eyes of a man who had seen too many good soldiers dragged through unnecessary battles. "Anything you need, ma'am, you say it." That was all he said. No questions, no judgment. And something in his tone made it clear that if anyone on base whispered the wrong thing, he would silence it immediately. But nothing he could do would stop what was already in motion. Linda had fired the first real shot. Not at my body. At my reputation. At my credibility. At the uniform she always resented because it gave me something she could never control. I walked back to my quarters that evening with the weight of the day pressing against every rib. In the distance, the flags outside headquarters snapped sharply in the wind. A reminder of everything I had fought to build. Everything Linda now hoped to take away. This was no longer about an argument on a porch. It was a campaign. And she had just opened fire. I received the call on a Wednesday afternoon, just as I finished a meeting with Major Branford regarding our upcoming airborne readiness cycle. The battalion administrative officer asked me to step into his office. His expression was polite, but careful the way people look at you when they are trying not to take sides. "Captain Hale," he said, "the complainant has requested a mediated conversation at the residence. CID recommends you attend voluntarily to clarify facts." His voice stayed even, but the implication was unmistakable. If I refused, it could be used to suggest I had something to hide. If I agreed, I would be walking willingly into the exact kind of trap Linda specialized in. I nodded anyway. It was the only move that would not look like guilt. By late afternoon, the sky over Spring Lake had turned a muted blue, the kind that always came after a day of slow humidity. I drove to the house with my uniform pressed sharp and my hair pulled tight the way I always wore it when I needed to keep every emotion contained. When I parked along the curb, I saw two neighbors standing in their yards, speaking quietly. My stomach tightened. News had spread. It always did. Linda opened the door before I reached the steps. She was wearing a soft cardigan and a delicate chain necklace, the same combination she used at church when she wanted people to believe she was gentle. Her voice trembled with practiced fragility. "Rowan, we really need to talk about what happened. This has gotten out of hand." It was carefully staged concern, the kind meant to make her look like the exhausted caretaker dealing with a difficult child. Derek appeared behind her phone in hand, already recording, though he pretended he was checking messages. His eyes gleamed with anticipation. I stood on the porch and kept my distance. "Let me make something clear before we start," I said quietly. "I am here because CID advised a conversation. I am not admitting to any of the accusations." Her eyebrows rose in feigned surprise. Accusations? Rowan, sweetheart, no one is accusing you. We are worried about you. She pressed a hand to her chest as if the idea pained her. You were shouting. You were threatening me. You scared me. Her voice wavered just enough for anyone listening from a distance to believe she was barely holding herself together. My jaw tightened. Linda was incapable of subtlety. She never simply lied. She built an entire emotional display around the lie, dressing it up with trembling hands and damp eyes. I repeated evenly that nothing like that had happened. The moment I said it, the softness in her posture flickered. Just enough that I saw the real Linda underneath. Sharp, edged, calculating. She covered it quickly with a wounded sigh. Derek moved to stand beside her, arms folded. I watched his thumb hover over the screen of his phone. He was waiting, not for truth, for a reaction. Linda stepped out onto the porch, positioning herself so her voice carried into the street. Sweetheart, you came at me so aggressively. You were not behaving like yourself. You have been under so much pressure in the army, and I think it is making you unstable. Unstable. She said it gently, as if she were trying to help, as if she were afraid of me, as if the captain who led soldiers was somehow dangerous because she could no longer be controlled. You raised your voice at me, she continued, and you threatened to break things. Her eyes flicked toward the neighbor 2 houses down, who was suddenly pulling out her phone. Then Linda added the line she had prepared for her audience. I love you, Rowan, but I will not let you hurt me. The words hit my chest like a slap. Hurt her. The woman who shoved me to the floor 48 hours ago was now playing the role of frightened mother clinging to her last threads of courage. My pulse beat hard into my ears, but I forced my voice low and steady. Linda, nothing you are saying is true. Her face twisted for a fraction of a second, not with fear, but irritation. Then she stepped closer and lowered her voice. You will say what I tell you to say, or I will bury you. The air left my lungs. That tone, that coldness, that familiar threat whispered into the cracks of my childhood was the real Linda, the one the neighborhood never saw until now. But before I could respond, she leaned back, tears filling her eyes as she said loudly for the neighbors, You see, this is what I am afraid of. I am trying to help her, and she is glaring at me like she wants to snap. The belt incident flashed through my mind. Her shove, her voice calling me stray. I clenched my jaw until I felt it ache. If I snapped even slightly, she would win. She needed one wrong look, one raised voice, one step too close to complete her performance. I breathed in slowly. I reminded myself of every soldier who had ever looked to me for steadiness. Losing control was a luxury I had never had, not as a child and not as a captain. I kept my voice even. I am not here to fight. I am here to clear the record. Her tears vanished instantly. She straightened and exhaled as if deeply burdened. Of course, but I just want you to admit you were aggressive. For the sake of your career. You could tell CID you were overwhelmed. They will understand. She wanted a confession, a crack she could widen. Behind her, Derek tilted his phone slightly so the camera caught my face. The moment felt suspended, a thin strand between past and present, between the girl who flinched and the woman who refused to. I looked at Derek first. Turn the phone off. His smug confidence faltered. Then I looked at Linda. I said clearly enough for the neighbors and their cameras, I did not yell at you. I did not threaten you. I did not break anything. Her mouth tightened. The crowd did not get the show she wanted. Her voice sharpened as she hissed, You will regret this. It was quiet, but the venom was unmistakable. The kind that lived in the walls of this house long before anyone outside heard it. I stepped back from the porch, not breaking eye contact. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is leave before someone paints their story onto you. As I walked toward my car, I heard a neighbor whisper, Maybe she is not the one who is unstable. Another said, That stepmother always seemed off. For the first time in years, the truth leaked through the cracks of Linda's performance. But the damage was already spreading. This controlled visit had not settled anything. It had only made one thing clear. Linda Hale was not done. She was escalating, and the next strike would be worse. The belt reappeared 2 days later, as if Linda had been waiting for the perfect moment to use it again. The air was thick with late afternoon heat when I pulled up to the house to collect the last box of my father's papers. I had told myself I would be in and out in under 5 minutes. No eye contact, no conversation, no room for Linda to twist anything. But the moment I stepped onto the porch, I saw the belt hanging from her hand like an extension of her fingers. Not rolled, not folded, hanging loose. Ready. Her smile was small and sharp. "So you came back?" "Of course you did. Burdens always crawl home." I exhaled through my nose, forcing the steadiness I used on soldiers during stress drills. "I just came for the box I left. I do not want trouble." She swung the belt lightly, testing its weight. "You always bring trouble." Then she pointed the tip of it at my face. "And today I am finished pretending." A neighbor watering plants across the street paused. Another 2 houses down lifted her phone. Linda noticed. Her whole posture shifted. She stepped closer, lifting the belt in a dramatic arc and shouting loudly enough to rattle the windows behind her. "Do not take one more step toward me. Do you hear me? You will not threaten me again." The words sliced through the quiet neighborhood like she had fired a flare into the sky. I froze, not out of fear, but calculation. Everything in her tone was performative, every syllable designed for the people watching. My chest tightened with something deeper than anger. She was not just lying, she was staging me. She took another step. Her voice turned shrill with manufactured terror. "If you come near me, I will defend myself." Derek appeared behind her, smirking like he had been waiting backstage for his cue. He stepped onto the porch just as I reached down to pick up the box by the railing. Suddenly, his hand shoved my shoulder, knocking me off balance. I hit the wooden step hard, the jolt knocking air from my lungs. Pain shot through my hip. Before I could stand, Derek planted his foot beside me, blocking my path. "Stay down." His tone was low enough for me alone. Linda gasped theatrically behind him. She raised the belt again, pointing it at me as if I were the threat. Memories rushed in without mercy. The smell of lemon cleaner from the old kitchen. The whistling sound the belt made when she snapped it in the air behind me. The hiss of her voice. "You make me do this?" If you listened, I wouldn't have to. The crack across my legs when I was 12. The sting across my arm at 13 because Derek lied and she believed him instantly. Or pretended to. The nights I pressed myself into the far corner of my bedroom so I would not hear her footsteps in the hall. I blinked and the porch came back into focus, but the ache in my chest felt like both past and present colliding. Derek crouched down close enough for me to see the tiny scar near his eyebrow, the one he claimed I caused when we were younger, even though he tripped over his own skateboard. He whispered, voice raised, "And you lose everything." "Do it. Give her what she wants." I forced each breath to stay even. "You both need to move." His grin widened. "Say it louder." Linda stepped off the last step, standing so the sun hit the belt in her hand. "Captain Hale has come here again to frighten me." She was not speaking to me. She was speaking to the phones lifting slowly around the neighborhood. She jabbed the belt toward my face. "Look at her glare. She is unstable." She snapped the belt in the air. The sound cracked like it used to, splitting memory from reality. Something deep inside me folded the part of me that used to shrink at that sound. But something else rose too. The part of me that had led soldiers through nights colder than this moment, through jumps higher than this porch roof, through fear sharper than this humiliation. I straightened slowly. Derek shoved my shoulder again, but I planted my palm on the step, steadying myself. "Stand up and you prove her point," he whispered. "Stay down and we win." My jaw tightened. Then Linda leaned forward and hissed quietly enough for only me to hear. "You will never outrank me in this house. I own the story. You are what I say you are." And that broke something, not a loss of control. Something stronger, a refusal to surrender the last piece of myself she had tried to take. I rose in one swift motion, brushing dirt from my uniform. Derek startled. Linda took one step back, not because I threatened them, but because for the first time I stood without flinching. I lifted my chin. Linda put the belt down. She snapped back into her performance voice, rising. "She is yelling at me. Someone call the police." People whispered. Someone filmed. Someone else muttered, "She is not yelling." Linda turned her body toward the small audience forming on the sidewalk and held the belt slightly higher as if she needed them to see it. Her voice cracked. "She is dangerous. She has changed." Derek moved beside her again. He forced his face into a mask of concern. "Ma, let's go inside. She is not herself." I looked at him. Then I said, "Clearly, I am leaving. Let me pass." For a brief moment, Derek hesitated as if unsure whether the game should continue. Then Linda lowered the belt slowly, realizing she had not gotten the reaction she needed. She stepped aside with a tremble that fooled no one. I walked past them steady and silent, my pulse thudding against my ribs. A neighbor jogged closer and whispered, "We saw everything. You did nothing wrong." But humiliation still burned under my skin. My father's house, my childhood street, my stepfamily performing the same script they had used on me for years. This was the lowest point, the first true bottom of the story. Not because they hurt me, but because they did not realize they no longer could. And in that small truth, something in me shifted. The climb back up had begun. I drove back to Fort Liberty that night with my hands tied around the steering wheel and the image of Linda's belt still burned into my vision. But humiliation had a strange effect on me. It didn't break me. It sharpened me. It forced everything into focus like someone tightening a camera lens. If Linda wanted a war built on lies, then I would fight her with truth documented in every possible way. I started with the one thing the Army teaches you from day one. Evidence wins. Emotion loses. The following morning, I stopped by the legal assistance office on post. A specialist at the front desk gave me a packet listing what civilians and service members were allowed to document in disputes. Audio recordings in North Carolina were legal as long as one party consented. That meant I could record every conversation with Linda as long as I was part of it, and she would never know. Then I met Major Elise Branford in the battalion conference room. She shut the door, crossed her arms, and looked at me like she was scanning for damage. "You holding steady?" "Barely." "Good. Barely still counts. What did CID ask?" "The basics. And Derek is pushing lies online." Elise cursed under her breath. She had never been the emotional type, but loyalty ran thick in her veins. Then she tapped the packet I brought. "You need to start collecting your own record. Do not wait for CID. They work slow on domestic complaints. By the time they finish, the narrative is already set." I nodded. My mind was already moving. I went back to my quarters and began sorting my phone, backing up messages, creating folders labeled by date. Step 1. Capture everything. I drove out to Spring Lake again, but this time I stayed inside my car and turned on the voice memo app before calling Linda. The second she answered, her tone was clipped and irritated. "Why are you calling me again?" I kept my voice neutral. "I need the rest of Dad's documents. It is my legal right to review them." Her breath hissed through the phone. "You have no rights. You are not his real child." That sentence became the first clear piece of audio proof. When she hung up, I stayed parked along the curb as neighbors walked their dogs. 2 stopped near my window. They hesitated before one of them spoke. "We saw the belt. We saw her yelling. You did nothing. If CID comes, we will talk." I wrote down their names immediately. Witnesses, statements. I needed every angle. Over the next 2 days, I collected 5 different accounts from people who had seen Linda shove me, point the belt, or shout accusations. None of them liked getting involved. But the moment they heard Linda had filed a report painting me as violent, their faces changed. "No, ma'am. We are not letting her blame this on you." Meanwhile, Derek kept escalating online. He posted vague warnings about unstable veterans. He wrote that he feared for his mother's life. He used phrases like dangerous, threatening, violent after deployment. I screenshotted every post, every comment, every time someone replied, "I hope your sister gets help." At nearly midnight on Thursday, I sat at my desk gathering all the pieces: screenshots, audio, witness names, timeline, every detail that contradicted Linda's narrative. The weight of it made my hands steady instead of shaking. I felt like a soldier preparing for an airborne mission. You pack your gear, you double-check your chute. You know that when the door opens, you either jump ready or fall uncontrolled. I chose ready. The next morning, Elise called me into her office. Her hair was pulled tight, her makeup minimal, but her expression was focused enough to cut glass. "Take a seat." I did. She placed a stack of printed forms in front of me. "I took a look at your property documents, the ones you submitted 2 weeks ago. Something is off." My pulse lifted. "What do you mean?" She slid a page toward me. "This signature, it is supposed to be your father's, but it is not consistent with the signatures on his medical directives or his notarized will from 8 years ago." My breath hitched. "Are you saying it is forged?" Elise tapped the corner of the page. "I am saying whoever signed this did a bad job hiding it. And if this document was used to transfer property rights, someone committed fraud." Fraud. The word rang in my mind like a bell. Fraud meant motive. Motive meant investigation. Investigation meant Linda's entire narrative would collapse. I leaned back in the chair. She forged my dad's signature. Elise nodded once, then added, calmly but firmly, "You need to understand something. This is not just a family dispute anymore. This is criminal. And if CID uncovers this before you show them your own evidence, she will shift the blame onto you. She will claim you signed it or pressured someone else. You must get ahead of her." For the first time in days, I felt the ground shift in my favor. Not victory. Not yet. But leverage. Proof that Linda was not the frightened stepmother in her story. She was the architect, the manipulator, the one who had everything to lose. When I left Elise's office, the sky over Fort Liberty was a deep Carolina blue. Paratroopers were running drills on the field, calling cadence that rose and fell like steady thunder. I had jumped out of aircraft into darkness. I had led soldiers through chaos. I had survived Linda's household. I could survive this. But as I sat in my car, I felt a question rise in my chest, heavy and bitter. Can your own family become the greatest enemy you ever face? And I knew the answer. Yes. Absolutely yes. If someone out there has ever lived it, tell me. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done? I didn't expect the truth to be sitting in a cracked cardboard box under a stack of tax forms and warranty manuals, but that was exactly where it waited. A 5-year secret. A signature Linda could never fake. And a father's voice speaking from beyond the grave in the only way left to him. It was Saturday morning when I returned to the house. I didn't go inside. I wouldn't give Linda a second of performance time. Instead, I waited until she and Derek left, probably off to another neighborhood gathering where she could rehearse her broken-hearted stepmother routine. When their car pulled out, I walked straight to the backyard shed. My father kept everything that mattered to him in that shed: fishing rods, old boots, photo albums, boxes labeled in his handwriting, and things Linda never bothered to touch because they weren't hers to control. The air inside smelled like dust and cedar. I pulled the chain for the overhead bulb. Yellow light flickered across stacks of boxes, each corner softened by time. I knelt in front of the box labeled personal papers. My hands shook just slightly as I lifted the lid. I expected old bills, maybe scribbled notes, maybe nothing at all. But 5 inches down, tucked between a folder marked insurance and a manual for a 1998 lawnmower, I found an envelope. Heavy, cream-colored, official, sealed with a red notary stamp already faded with age. Across the front was my father's handwriting, unmistakable, looping slightly to the right. Rowan, only mine, not Linda, not shared with Derek, not tucked upstairs in the house she controlled. A letter. But when I turned it over, a thicker stack slid out from behind it. A document binder. My breath froze when I saw the header. Last Will and Testament of Michael Hale. My father's real will. Not the one Linda had shown to neighbors years ago. Not the one she referenced whenever she wanted to remind me I had nothing. Not the one claiming everything belonged to her. My hands trembled as I opened it carefully. The pages were crisp, clean, untouched, and every signature belonged to my father, dated 5 years earlier, 3 years before he died. I blinked hard as I read the first paragraph. I, Michael Hale, being of sound mind, designate my daughter Rowan Hale as the sole beneficiary of my estate, including but not limited to the residence located in Spring Lake, North Carolina. Sole beneficiary. My eyes stung. For a moment, the shed blurred. He had chosen me. He had trusted me. He had left everything to me because in his quiet, gentle way, he had known exactly who needed protecting after he was gone. And Linda had buried it, literally, buried it in a shed where she thought I would never look. My heart thudded so hard in my chest I could hear it. It wasn't just fraud. It wasn't just manipulation. It was erasure, a deliberate attempt to remove me from my own father's life and legacy. I sat back on my heels, the will held carefully in my hands as if it were something sacred. I remembered the night he went into the hospital. Linda had stood outside his room pretending to weep while nurses comforted her. Derek had been scrolling his phone, and I had been the one holding my father's hand. He had squeezed it weakly and whispered, "You are stronger than all of them." I thought he meant emotionally. I thought he meant in spirit. I didn't realize he meant legally. He had left everything to me because he knew Linda would take it all if he didn't put protection in writing. I opened the envelope next. Inside was a letter in his familiar script. My Rowan, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and it means I did not have the strength to tell you what I should have told you long ago. You are my only child, my only legacy. This house is yours, my savings, my belongings, all of it. Do not let Linda convince you otherwise. You were never less than never second class, never stray. You are my daughter, my pride, my heart. Love, Dad. I didn't realize I was crying until a tear fell directly onto the page. I wiped it quickly, terrified of smudging any part of his handwriting. My entire chest felt tight, not with grief, not with anger. Something heavier, something sharper. Validation. Proof that every cruel word Linda had ever thrown at me was a lie. But that wasn't the end of the document. The final page stopped my breath altogether. A notarized amendment. It stated that if the will was contested or interfered with in any way, the court was to assume malicious intent. Malicious intent. Meaning if Linda hid it, forged anything, altered anything, she was committing a criminal act. I closed the binder slowly. Every piece fit together now with painful clarity. Linda had hidden the will because she knew the truth destroyed her entire story. It destroyed her power. It destroyed her ability to claim I was nothing. And it explained the sudden urgency behind her false report to CID. If I looked dangerous, unstable, unfit, then she could argue I didn't deserve the inheritance. She could twist my career into a liability. She could paint me as a threat. And Derek was her megaphone. Their entire strategy made sense now, and it was falling apart in my hands. I walked out of the shed with the will held tight to my chest. The sun had dipped low over the rooftops. Neighbors were returning from errands. One older man across the street waved and said, "Everything all right, Captain Hale?" I swallowed hard. For the first time in years, I felt something close to certainty. Yes, it will be. When I reached my car, I placed the will in a sealed file folder and locked it in my trunk. I didn't shake anymore. I didn't doubt myself. I didn't fear the next step, because now I knew this wasn't a dispute between stepmother and stepdaughter. This was a cover-up, a theft, a betrayal 5 years deep. And I finally had the proof to tear it all open. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was justice. And justice was finally on my side. The community church in Fayetteville had never felt so suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and old hymn books as people filed into the memorial hall where we were gathering to honor my father. The ceremony was supposed to be quiet and respectful, a simple remembrance for a man who had lived a modest life. But as I walked in wearing my Class A uniform metal ribbons aligned perfectly across my chest, I felt every eye turn toward me, and then subtly drift toward Linda, who was already seated in the front row pretending to dab her eyes. Her shoulders trembled dramatically as she clutched a lace handkerchief. She looked like a grieving widow from a movie, someone noble and wounded holding herself together for the sake of dignity. She noticed me walking in and straightened slightly as if preparing for a performance. Derek sat beside her, scrolling his phone with a self-satisfied smirk, the same expression he wore when he lied about me in the neighborhood group. I ignored both of them and stepped up to the podium where the slideshow equipment had been arranged. Two deacons from the church stood near the projector ready to help me present a short tribute video of my father. They believed that was all I planned to show. For a moment, my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. My fingers curled tightly around the edge of the podium. This was the moment the entire story would shift. This was the moment truth would detonate. I took a slow breath. Then I spoke. "Thank you all for coming to honor my father." There were murmurs of agreement, some smiles, but most people instinctively glanced toward Linda, who immediately lowered her head as though overcome by emotion. I continued. "Before we play the tribute video, I need to show you something important. Something my father would want the community to know." Linda's head whipped up, her eyes narrowed. Derek sat upright. I clicked the remote. The projector screen lit up, and the first clip began to play. It was the recording from my phone on the day she screamed at me on the porch. The video was crystal clear. Linda's voice poured across the room. "You are a stray I picked up. A burden. Useless. Get off my property." A gasp rippled through the audience. People leaned forward. Some covered their mouths. Linda shot to her feet. "That is taken out of context." I raised my voice. "Sit down." The authority in my tone cut straight through the noise. I was not yelling. I was commanding. A captain speaking to someone who had spent years hiding behind lies. Linda froze mid-step. She sank back into her seat slowly, her face pale. I pressed the remote again. The second clip played. Audio only. The belt incident. Her voice echoed through the hall. "I should have hit you harder when you were a kid." The room erupted into shocked whispers. A woman in the second row stared at Linda with wide eyes. A man shook his head in disgust. A teenager whispered loudly, "That is abuse." Linda's face turned a shade of gray I had never seen on her before. She stammered, "That audio is fake. She is manipulating everyone." Derek leapt up. "You all do not understand. She is dangerous. She is unstable from deployment." I kept my eyes locked on the audience. "We are not done." The projector changed again. This time it showed scanned paperwork blown up larger than life. The fraudulent property transfer documents. The signature that was supposed to be my father's but was nothing like the real one. I stepped beside the screen and pointed. "This signature was used to remove my inheritance. My father did not sign this." "She did." Linda bolted up again. "That is a lie. Your father wanted me to have everything. He said you were ungrateful." I pulled out the real will and held it in the air. The room fell dead silent. "This is my father's actual will. Signed, dated, notarized. Hidden by Linda in the backyard shed for 5 years. The gasp this time was not a ripple. It was a shockwave. One woman stood up and shouted, "She hid a will." Another man muttered, "That is illegal." Someone else hissed, "She stole from his daughter." Derek stumbled backward like someone had shoved him. His phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the wooden floor. Linda shook her head violently. "He never made that will." "You forged that. You are framing me." I opened the binder to the page with the notary seal and held it toward the audience. The notary name, the date, the signatures, all real, all verified. The pastor himself stepped forward to look. When he raised his head, his expression was sorrowful but unmistakably firm. "This is authentic." Linda let out a strangled cry. "You cannot do this to me! You cannot ruin my life!" My voice stayed calm. "I am not ruining anything. I am revealing what you did." The projector shifted again. The last slide came up. Photos of the shed. Photos of the box labeled personal papers. Photos of the envelope addressed to me in my father's handwriting. The evidence was absolute. A woman whispered, "She did all that for money." Another man added, and to destroy her stepdaughter. Then, from the far side of the room, someone said what half the audience was thinking. Monster! Linda's breath came fast and shallow. She grabbed Derek's sleeve as if begging him to save her, but he yanked his arm away. His face crumpled in panic. I did not know about the will. I swear, I did not know. I looked him dead in the eye. You helped her lie. You helped her smear me. You helped her try to destroy my career. He shook his head again and again before finally doing the one thing cowards always do. He ran. Literally ran out of the sanctuary doors, pushing past people as he fled to the parking lot. I turned back to Linda. She now looked small, smaller than I had ever seen her. Her chest heaved, her hands trembled violently. She whispered, barely audible, "This is not happening." I stepped toward her. My boots echoed against the wooden platform. I held the will in one hand, the fraudulent documents in the other. "It is happening. And you did this to yourself." The audience wasn't whispering anymore. They were staring, judging, condemning. Everything Linda had built for years, every lie, every performance, every carefully crafted illusion disintegrated right there under the fluorescent light of the church memorial hall. Then the pastor spoke, voice heavy with disappointment. "Linda Hale, you owe this community an explanation." She stared at the floor, frozen, as if the truth had pinned her to the spot. But there was nothing left to explain. The truth was already exposed. Her downfall was complete. I closed my father's will carefully, as if closing the last chapter of a long nightmare. Then I looked at the crowd one final time. My voice stayed steady. My father deserved honesty. I deserved justice. And now the truth is out. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, final, and it belonged to me. The morning after the memorial felt strangely quiet at Fort Liberty, as if the base itself needed a moment to settle after what had happened at the church. But the peace didn't last long. When I opened my laptop before PT formation, the first thing I saw was an email notification from an address I knew too well. Linda. The subject line read, "You think this is over." My stomach tightened before I even clicked it. The body was a wall of frantic messages written without punctuation, without breath, without any trace of the composed woman she pretended to be in public. "You humiliated me, you ungrateful brat. You will pay for this. You ruined my reputation. You stole my life. Your father hated you. You were nothing but a stray, he pitied. I will make sure everyone knows what you are." I stared at the screen for a long moment. It wasn't the words that shook me. It was the unraveling beneath them. Linda sounded cornered. Cornered people clawed hardest. I forwarded the message to myself, downloaded a copy, and added it to the evidence folder on my desktop. 10 minutes later, another email came, then another, and another. Some were long rants accusing me of sabotaging her life. Others were short and vicious, like sharp little strikes meant to bruise. "You think the army will keep you once they hear the truth. You think the neighbors believe you. They pity you. You have no one." I rubbed my eyes. She was exactly as dangerous as someone with nothing left to lose. That afternoon, during a break between training blocks, First Sergeant Keller approached me with a firm look. "Ma'am, you look like you got hit by a truck." I told him the truth in a low voice. "Linda is spiraling. She is emailing me non-stop." He nodded in that heavy, deliberate way of someone who understood escalation better than most. "Then you need to take this to CID immediately. Do not respond. Do not engage. Do not let her bait you." I didn't plan to respond anyway. Her emails were ammunition. Mine would only be fuel. I walked to the CID office with a folder so thick it barely fit under my arm. Lieutenant Carson met me in the same private room where he had first interviewed me. He looked different today, though. More alert, more guarded. "Captain Hale, you said you had additional information for the investigation." I placed the folder on the table. He opened it and began sorting through the documents, photos, recordings, and printed emails, while his expression gradually sharpened. "Where did you get this?" "My father's shed, and her own inbox." He paused on the will. When he read the words "sole beneficiary," his jaw tightened for the first time since I met him. Captain, this is not a family dispute anymore. This is potential felony fraud. I swallowed as the weight of the truth settled into the room. Fraud, forgery, false reports to a federal agency, character assassination. And that was before considering the emotional abuse, the public manipulation, and the collapsing mask she wore at the memorial. CID opened a formal case that same afternoon. Carson stood from the table and said quietly, "We will handle this by the book. You did the right thing coming forward." When I left the office, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the truth was finally entering official channels. Dread because Linda would never accept losing control without a final blow. That blow arrived at 2100 hours. My phone lit up with 6 voicemails in under 10 minutes. I didn't listen to them. I just forwarded them to my email and saved every file. But curiosity pricked at me in the way old wounds sometimes ache when touched. I clicked the most recent recording. Her voice came through the speaker raw and scraping. "You think you won yesterday. You think people believe you. They do not know what you really are. You humiliated me in front of everyone. You embarrassed this family." My breath caught when she choked out the next line. "I gave you a home. You owed me loyalty." Loyalty. The word twisted in my gut. I listened to another voicemail. This one was quieter but more venomous. "You will regret turning your back on me. You will regret making me your enemy." I clicked it off. I knew threats when I heard them, even when wrapped in emotional hysteria. When midnight approached, she sent a final email that was almost unreadable. The sentences were chaotic, the letters uneven. At the very bottom, she wrote, "I will destroy everything you have left." That was the moment I finally let my head fall into my hands. Not from fear, from exhaustion. Years of mental battles collapsed into that one line. She was no longer fighting for the house or the will or even her reputation. She was fighting because her mask had shattered and I was the one who broke it. Over the next week, the shift in Linda was visible from miles away, even if no one said it aloud. She stopped going to neighborhood gatherings. She stopped waving from her porch with that sweet smile she practiced in the mirror. She stopped posting uplifting quotes on Facebook. Instead, she posted vague, desperate rants accusing unnamed people of ruining her life. The neighbors commented cautiously at first, then not at all. Her friends distanced themselves. People stopped calling her victim. They started calling her liar. On Thursday afternoon, I received a call from the pastor who had overseen the memorial. His voice was low and heavy. "Captain Hale, I thought you should know. Linda came to the church today. She wanted to speak at Sunday service to defend herself." I asked what he told her, that it was not appropriate and that the community has seen enough. My chest tightened. The unraveling had begun. Word spread quickly in Spring Lake. Linda was seen screaming at the pharmacist when her insurance card was declined. She was overheard telling a neighbor that I had brainwashed CID. Another neighbor told me quietly that she found Linda sitting in her car crying uncontrollably in the grocery parking lot. Derek wasn't helping her. He barely left his house. His car sat in the driveway unmoved for days, and the porch light stayed off even at night. Without him propping up her lies, Linda stood alone. That loneliness became its own kind of collapse. The emails slowed, then stopped. But the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the air before a storm. CID updated me weekly each time, confirming that Linda's actions were more severe than initially believed. Lieutenant Carson spoke with a controlled professionalism that hid nothing. "Captain Hale, we have enough to proceed with full charges if approved. Forgery, fraud, false statements, attempted interference with a service member's career." My throat tightened as he continued. "This case is no longer small. She may face criminal penalties." Even hearing those words didn't bring me satisfaction. What I felt was a strange numbness, a disbelief that after years of enduring Linda's subtle cruelty, her empire was finally crumbling under the weight of her own actions. And yet, I knew this wasn't the end. Not the legal end, not the emotional end, not the end of her attempts to claw her way back. People like Linda didn't fade quietly. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the child at her mercy. I felt like the adult who finally had the truth on record and the army behind me. And as I closed my laptop that night, the question that had haunted me since childhood drifted through my mind again. How far will family go to hurt you when they can no longer control you? Then a second, colder question followed. And how far will you go to finally stop them? The answer was already unfolding. CID had taken the case. Linda's downfall had begun, and for the first time since this battle started, I felt the momentum shift entirely into my hands. 3 weeks passed after CID opened the formal case, and in that time, Linda's world shrank faster than anyone expected. The neighbors who once politely waved at her now crossed the street to avoid her. The women she used to gossip with outside the mailbox no longer answered her calls. Even the local Facebook group had turned against her, with one post bluntly stating that anyone defending Linda Hale should rewatch the footage and reconsider their moral compass. Derek had vanished from public view entirely. Not a single post, not a single appearance. His silence was not loyalty, it was self-preservation. Meanwhile, I continued my routine at Fort Liberty. PT at 0600, team briefs, airborne training prep, meetings with Major Branford, who watched me with a quiet vigilance as if waiting for signs that the stress might crack me. It never did. Structure kept me grounded. Military life had always given me the stability my childhood never could. But the moment of calm broke on a Tuesday afternoon when I heard the unexpected pounding at my door. Not knocking. Pounding. Sharp. Desperate. Familiar. I froze halfway down the hallway, recognizing the rhythm of her impatience instantly. Linda. For a moment, I wondered how she even found my on-post address. Then I remembered Derek still knew it from years ago. Of course she found it. She always found what she wanted to control. I opened the door only halfway enough to see her, but not enough for her to step in. She stood there on my porch, looking nothing like the woman who used to strut around Spring Lake as if she owned the entire neighborhood. Her hair was frizzy from humidity and her makeup blotchy like she had been crying or sweating or both. Her clothes hung awkwardly like she had rushed out of the house without looking in the mirror. And her eyes. They were wild in the way only people who have lost everything look. "Rowan, please, I need to talk to you." Her voice cracked in the middle like she was swallowing stones. I kept my tone flat. "You do not have any reason to be here." She shook her head violently. "No, you have to listen. It is important. Please." She glanced over her shoulder as if afraid someone might see her standing there. That alone told me she was desperate. Linda had never feared being seen before. She thrived on it. She fed on attention. Now, she hid from it. "Rowan, the case is getting out of control." She wrung her hands together. "They want to press charges, criminal charges. They want restitution. They want to go through my finances. They want everything." I held her gaze without blinking. "That tends to happen when someone commits fraud." She flinched like I had slapped her. "I am your stepmother," she whispered. Her voice softened into something she probably thought sounded maternal. "I raised you. You owe me something." Oh, I finally opened the door just a little wider. Not for her. For me. I wanted her to see clearly the look on my face. The kind that stopped arguments cold during field exercises. The kind that didn't bend. "You raised me to fear you. You taught me nothing but survival. And I owe you nothing." She let out a breath that was halfway between a sob and a gasp. "Rowan, please. They say I could lose the house. They say I might have to go to court. They say I might have to do time." Her eyes darted around like a trapped animal. "You have to fix this. You have to tell CID the will is fake." My chest tightened in disbelief. "You want me to commit perjury to save you?" She nodded quickly as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. "Yes. You can say you were confused. You can say you remembered wrong. You can say you acted out of emotion. They will believe a soldier before they believe me." For a moment, I didn't speak. Not because I was unsure of what to say, but because the audacity of her request hit so hard, I needed a moment to register it. After everything she had done, after the humiliation, the lies, the theft, the smear campaign, the belt, the false CID report. Now she had come to my home uninvited, standing on my doorstep, begging me to save her from consequences she created. Then she added the second part of her plea, the part that made my jaw clench. "The roof is leaking," she whispered. "My voice cracked 2 nights ago. The ceiling is sagging. I don't have the money for repairs. The house is falling apart. You need to help me cover the cost." I stared at her in stunned silence. She actually expected me to fund her life again, after hiding my inheritance, after filing false claims, after trying to destroy my military career. She continued rambling. "I cannot pay for lawyers. The banks will not extend my credit because they think I lied about something on my forms. You must help me. You must." I stepped fully outside and closed the door behind me so she could no longer look into my home. My space, my sanctuary. My voice was calm, ice, cold. "Linda, step away from my property." She froze. Her eyes went wide. "Rowan, you do not understand. If I lose that house, I have nothing. If I go to court alone, I have no one." I repeated it. "Step away from my property." She shook her head in disbelief. "You cannot be this heartless. You are supposed to be better than me. You are supposed to care." I leaned in just slightly. "I am better than you. That is why I am not screaming. That is why I am not threatening. That is why I am not lying to CID or forging documents. But being better than you does not mean saving you from consequences." Her breath trembled. She looked down at her hands. For a moment, she almost seemed small, human even. Then her voice shifted into bitterness. "You think you won. You think people respect you. You think that uniform makes you untouchable." Her eyes rose sharper now. "But you are still that little stray who should have been grateful for a roof. Nothing has changed." I held her gaze until she faltered. "Everything has changed. You no longer control the story." She swallowed hard. A tear slid down her cheek. "Not grief. Rage." Then she whispered the line that told me exactly who she always had been. "You will regret this." I stepped back. "But you will regret it sooner." I walked to the edge of the porch and pointed to the sidewalk. "Leave. Now." She finally stepped backward. 1 step, 2, 3. Her chest rose and fell like each breath scraped her lungs. Then she turned and hurried to her car, slamming the door before speeding away. I watched her taillights vanish down the road. My hands trembled not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally ending a lifetime of emotional warfare. When I stepped back into my house, the silence wrapped around me like armor. But I felt something else, too. A question rising inside me that I knew thousands of people have faced in their own battles. Would you forgive someone like that? Would you open the door again? Would you give them another chance? If you were standing where I was, what would you have done? The legal process moved slowly at first, the way heavy machinery takes time to warm up before it starts grinding forward. But once it did, it felt unstoppable. CID contacted me before sunrise one Friday morning while I was preparing for airborne operations. My phone buzzed against the metal bench outside the hangar, and I stepped away from the formation to answer. "Captain Hale, this is Lieutenant Carson. We need you to come in this afternoon. There have been developments." His voice held a firmness that told me whatever was about to unfold would be critical. I spent the rest of the morning executing jump prep with my company, but my focus kept drifting back to that call. I could feel something shifting the same way the air changes before a storm. By 1300 hours, I walked into the CID office with my uniform still smelling faintly of the flight line. Lieutenant Carson guided me into the briefing room, and for the first time since the investigation began, there was another agent present, a senior warrant officer whose demeanor carried the weight of authority. Carson folded his hands. "Captain Hale, we have received statements from several neighbors. They corroborate your recordings and provide independent accounts of what happened on the porch." My breath loosened with relief even though I already knew the truth. Then he added, "We also received confirmation from the notary who signed your father's will. The signature is authentic. The document is legitimate." I nodded slowly. "So Linda hid a valid will." Carson exchanged a look with the warrant officer. "More than that, a signed and notarized will carries legal weight. Hiding it for financial gain is considered willful concealment." "That is fraud," The warrant officer leaned forward, and using forged paperwork to claim ownership of the property is a felony. My pulse kicked up as the reality formed. Linda wasn't just cruel. She wasn't just manipulative. She was a criminal. Carson continued. Derek is also under review for assisting in distributing false statements and participating in the concealment. My stomach tightened, not out of pity, but out of the cold clarity that this would finally hold both of them accountable. What happens now? Carson straightened the stack of papers before him. We are forwarding the case to the district attorney's office for prosecution. At this stage, the Army cannot compel civilian charges, but the evidence is compelling enough that they likely will. You will retain the original will and property rights pending court confirmation. It felt surreal standing in that sterile room, hearing the words I had waited my entire life to hear. Someone was finally believing me. Someone with authority was finally holding Linda accountable. But the victory didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, burdensome, necessary. A few weeks later, the official summons arrived. The case would be heard in Cumberland County Court. Fraud, forgery, willful concealment, harassment, false reporting. I sat in my car after reading the document, letting the weight settle. It was happening. After years of living under Linda's shadow, the legal system was about to shine a bright, unforgiving light on her actions. The courthouse felt colder than I expected the morning of the hearing. Polished floors, low voices, the soft shuffle of papers echoing down the hallways. I wore my uniform not out of arrogance but out of truth. It represented a life I built myself independent of the household that tried to break me. When I entered the courtroom, Linda was already seated at the plaintiff's table with a public defender beside her. She looked nothing like the woman who had once paraded herself around the community as the pillar of propriety. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes hung awkwardly, her hands shook uncontrollably, even as she tried to clasp them tightly. Derek sat behind her in a wrinkled shirt, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. When he saw me, he looked away quickly, as if he couldn't face the consequences of his own participation. The judge entered, and the room hushed. The proceedings began with statements from the attorneys and then quickly shifted to evidence review. My recordings played once again, this time in a setting where every word became part of a permanent record. Linda's voice echoed across the courtroom. "You are a stray I picked up. You should be grateful I do not hit you more." Gasps whispered through the room as people listened. Then came the belt audio, the forged documents, the real will, the notarized letter, the reports from CID. One by one the lies unraveled until nothing remained but the truth exposed in harsh, bright detail. Linda covered her face with both hands. At one point, she whispered something to her defender, but he only shook his head slowly. Facts were immovable. Facts didn't bow to tears. When it was Derek's turn to speak, he stumbled through his words. "I didn't know she hid the will. I didn't know it was fake. I just did what she told me." The judge stared at him for a long moment. "You assisted in spreading false statements. You helped her attempt to damage Captain Hale's career and reputation. You knowingly escalated a situation without verifying facts. That is participation." Derek swallowed and nodded, unable to argue. Then it was my turn. I stood, took a breath, and told the court the truth. Not with emotion, not with anger. Just truth. What Linda said, what she did, what she hid, what she tried to destroy. When I finished, the courtroom felt still, quiet. The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Frances Linda Hale, you intentionally concealed a valid last will and testament. You filed fraudulent documents for personal gain. You attempted to interfere with the military career of your stepdaughter through false accusations. You manipulated and deceived your community. This court finds you guilty." Linda's shoulders collapsed inward as if the words themselves had weight. She whispered something I couldn't hear. The judge continued, "You are ordered to pay restitution equal to the value of the property withheld, as well as additional penalties associated with your fraudulent actions. The house and all associated assets are legally transferred to Captain Rowan Hale, effective immediately." My breath caught. It was done. After years of believing I had no voice, no claim, no place in my father's home, The law had restored everything Linda tried to take. The bailiff asked Linda to stand. She did so shakily, her knees trembling, her face drained of color. The judge concluded, "You may appeal the sentence, but the evidence against you is overwhelming. Actions have consequences." As she was escorted out of the courtroom, she looked back at me with a hollow devastation. Not remorse, not apology, only disbelief that her story had finally failed. Derek remained seated as everyone else stood to leave. He couldn't lift his head. He couldn't meet my eyes. I walked past him, slowly, stopping only long enough to say the words that had lived in my chest since childhood. Choices define us. You made yours. When I stepped outside the courthouse, sunlight struck my face warm and clean, and for the first time since my father died, I felt the air settle around me like release. Everything Linda took was restored. Everything she broke in my life finally had room to heal. Justice wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, it was steady, unmoving, and my story had finally shifted toward peace. The morning of my military review felt heavier than any airborne ruck march I had ever done. Even with the legal battle behind me and the court ruling in my favor, CID still had to complete their internal assessment. The Army did not rely on civilian decisions. They followed their own procedures, their own discipline, their own truth. And I respected that more than anything else. I woke at 04:30 earlier than usual, unable to shake the faint anxiety that crept into my chest as I dressed in my duty uniform. Every ribbon felt heavier than usual as I pinned it to my blouse. Every button seemed to click into place with deliberate weight. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror, the green fabric absorbing the dim light. A captain, a leader, a woman who had held the line under pressure most civilians could not imagine. But even soldiers had limits, and today I needed to prove that mine had not been breached. At 07:30, I arrived at the headquarters building and checked in with the administrative clerk. She nodded politely, but I could feel the awareness behind her eyes. Everyone in the battalion knew what had happened by now. Soldiers talked. NCOs talked more. Officers talked quietly but consistently. Major Elise Branford was waiting for me outside the conference room. She stood tall with her arms folded behind her back, her posture sharp as if carved from discipline itself. When she saw me approach, her expression softened just slightly. "You ready?" I exhaled. "As ready as I can be." She held my gaze a moment longer. "Good, because whatever happens in there today, you already did the hard part. You told the truth. You held the line. Not everyone can do that." She opened the door. Inside, 3 members of the review panel sat at a long table. A lieutenant colonel from the brigade staff, a senior warrant officer from CID, and a sergeant major whose presence alone could settle a room. They instructed me to sit. The questioning was professional but intense. "Captain Hale described the nature of the dispute with your stepmother." I explained the full timeline, sticking to facts, not emotions. "Repeat the exact wording you used during the confrontation on the porch." I repeated it, calm, controlled. "Now identify any moment where you believe your conduct could be interpreted as aggressive or unprofessional." "None." My tone remained measured, not defensive. I detailed my evidence, the recordings, the forged paperwork, the concealed will. They asked about my emotional state during the conflicts. Stable, focused, not reactive. They asked whether I had ever raised my voice, used intimidation, or acted in a way that could be interpreted as threatening. No. And the recordings proved it. They asked about my chain of command, whether I had notified them appropriately, whether I had allowed the situation to bleed into my military responsibilities. Yes. And no. I had notified Major Branford immediately. I had maintained duty performance without compromise. The questions continued for nearly an hour, each one peeling back layers of the incident, confirming or disproving every claim Linda had made. Finally, the sergeant major asked, "Captain, do you believe your stepmother filed her report with malicious intent?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because she was trying to destroy my credibility and block my legal right to my father's estate." The sergeant major nodded slowly, his jaw tight. A few minutes later, they dismissed me from the room. I stepped into the hallway where the silence felt louder than the questioning had been. The minutes passed slow and thick. Soldiers walked past carrying binders and reports, greeting me with polite nods. Some looked at me with empathy, some with curiosity. All of them knew what this review meant. A military reputation was not just a career, it was identity, it was honor, it was everything we carried with us into the field. When the door finally opened, Lieutenant Carson stepped out with a neutral expression. "Captain Hale, the panel is ready for you." My heart hammered against my ribs as I re-entered the room. The lieutenant colonel stood. "Captain Rowan Hale, the review board has assessed the allegations against you." He paused long enough for the air to thicken. "The board finds no evidence of misconduct," the CID representative continued. "All claims made against you were determined to be false, fabricated, or intentionally misleading." The sergeant major added, "Your conduct during the incidents was professional at all times. Your responses were appropriate and consistent with Army values." The lieutenant colonel concluded, "Therefore, this review is closed. No reprimand, no notes to your file, no impact to your career." My breath left my lungs in a slow, controlled exhale. Relief did not rush through me. It settled, quiet, steady, like the feeling of landing safely after a long jump. As I left the headquarters building, the sunlight struck the pavement in wide, bright streaks. Soldiers trained on the field nearby, calling cadence that echoed across the base. My boots hit the ground with a rhythm that felt sharper than before. I headed toward the company area where the afternoon brief was about to begin. When I walked inside, my entire company stood in formation. Major Branford stood at the front. Her expression was unreadable until she nodded to First Sergeant Keller. He stepped forward, voice booming with authority. "Company attention!" The soldiers snapped to, eyes forward, shoulders squared. Major Branford approached me with something small in her hand, a challenge coin. Not a generic one, a battalion-level coin, engraved, heavy, earned, Captain Hale. She said clearly in front of the entire formation, "You demonstrated Army professionalism under fire. You upheld integrity in circumstances designed to break it. Your conduct reflects great credit upon yourself and this battalion." She placed the coin firmly in my palm. The metal felt cool and solid against my skin. The formation began to clap, sharp, respectful, the kind of applause that carried weight. Not pity applause, not sympathy applause, recognition, validation. I swallowed hard against the lump in my throat as I stood at attention. This moment felt more powerful than the court ruling, because these were the people I served with, the people who trusted me in the field, the people who needed to know I was unshakable. When the clapping ended, Major Branford leaned in just enough for only me to hear. "You did not just survive this. You showed every soldier here what resilience looks like." I nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." As the formation dismissed and soldiers approached offering quiet congratulations, I felt something I had not felt in months. Stability, respect, belonging. For the first time since my father died, the ground beneath my feet felt solid. Not because the storm had ended, but because I had stood through it without breaking. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but honor had been restored on the parade field, and that meant more than Linda could ever understand. I drove back to my father's house 2 days after the battalion formation, where Major Branford handed me the challenge coin, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel dread pulling at my stomach as I turned onto the familiar street. The neighborhood of Spring Lake looked different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because the weight I used to carry every time I saw these houses was finally gone. The sky was clear and soft, the Carolina sun glowing through the longleaf pines, and for once, I felt no tension in my shoulders as I parked in front of the house that had shaped more of my childhood than I ever wanted to admit. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time before going inside, just looking at the place. The gray siding, the creaking porch, the front windows that still had the same slightly crooked shutters. Everything looked frozen in time, like a photograph I had stepped out of years ago, but never truly left behind. But this time, the house belonged to me, legally, emotionally, completely. And that truth steadied me in ways I did not expect. When I finally walked up the steps and unlocked the front door, a rush of scent met me, old wood and dust mixed with the faint, lingering trace of my father's aftershave, and the moment it hit me, my eyes stung in a way I had not prepared for. He had been gone for years, but parts of him were still here, tucked into corners of the house Linda never bothered to touch. For a long moment, I stood in the doorway, my hand on the frame, breathing in deeply until my heartbeat leveled. Healing, I realized, did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, some soft, some sharp, but all of them necessary. The inside of the house looked almost identical to the last time I had seen it. Linda never changed anything because she was too consumed with appearances to risk altering the image she showed the neighborhood. But I saw the house differently now, not as a place where fear lived in the walls, not as a battleground from my childhood, but as a space that could finally become something clean, something new, something mine. I started with the living room. I opened every window until sunlight poured into the house. Then I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. The first thing I removed was the old couch where Linda used to sit pretending to cry whenever she needed sympathy. I dragged it out to the curb without hesitation. I tore down the curtains she had hung thick ones that blocked the sun and made the house feel like a place where secrets were supposed to stay hidden. I replaced them with sheer ones that let the light in. I scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed instead of creaked. I knew most people would have hired a crew, but for me, the act of doing it myself felt important. It felt personal, like reclaiming a part of my childhood that had been stolen. Every sweep of the mop, every lifted box, every window washed clean, it all felt like peeling away layers of old fear that had stuck to me for too long. The hardest room to enter was my father's bedroom. The door stuck a little when I pushed it open, and for a second I froze in the doorway, not sure if I was ready to see it. But I stepped in anyway. The room was still neat the way he always kept it. His old dresser with the brass handles, his worn leather wallet on top of it, the framed photo of us fishing at Lake Johnson when I was 12. I sat on the edge of his bed and let the memories move through me without fighting them. I remembered his quiet strength, his soft way of saying, "You did good, kiddo." The way he always squeezed my shoulder gently, as if to tell me he saw me even when the rest of the house tried to erase me. I whispered into the empty room, "I found your will, Dad. You tried to protect me, and now I am protecting what you left behind." The ache in my chest was deep, but it did not hollow me the way grief used to. It grounded me, strengthened me. Once the cleaning was done, I began transforming the house room by room. I painted the living room a soft pine green, the color he always said reminded him of early mornings in the woods. I hung photos of him and me from before Linda entered our lives, moments untouched by manipulation, moments that reminded me that I was not born from fear. I came from love, even if it was quiet. In the backyard, I uncovered the small garden patch my father used to tend. The soil was dry and cracked, but still held the shape of the rose he once planted. I knelt in the dirt, let it run between my fingers, and felt something old inside me loosen. I decided I would restore the garden. Not for him, for myself. A reminder of growth after hardship. After weeks of work, the house no longer looked like the place from my nightmares. It looked warm, lived in, mine. And every time I walked through the rooms, I felt something settle deeper inside me, a steadiness that had been missing for years. On post, my emotional clarity surprised even me. During PT, I ran smoother than I had in months. During airborne drills, I felt sharper, more focused. In meetings with Major Branford, I no longer had that tightness around my thoughts, the constant tension that had once clouded my judgment. She noticed. One afternoon, after a company brief, she approached me outside the headquarters building as we walked across the pavement, glowing under the sun. "You look lighter," she said. "Not weaker, lighter." I gave a small nod. "I guess taking back what is mine helps." She smiled faintly. Healing always does. I found myself reconnecting with parts of life I had pushed aside for too long. I started journaling at night, something I had not done since basic training. I visited the gym during quiet hours just to focus on movement rather than performance. I took long walks around the base, listening to the rhythms of the barracks and the hum of training cycles, letting the steadiness of military life anchor me again. Slowly, I felt something shift inside me, not dramatically, but quietly and deeply. My thoughts were no longer tangled in defense. My emotions no longer sat on a tight wire between anger and resignation. For the first time in years, I felt emotionally stable, not because there was no pain left, but because I finally had space to feel it safely. One evening, I returned to my father's house after a long day of training. The sunset cast warm gold light across the living room walls. I sat on the new couch and allowed myself a moment of stillness. The house was peaceful, not silent in an uncomfortable way. Peaceful in the way a place becomes when no one is screaming into it anymore. As I breathed in the calm, I realized something that hit with unexpected force. I had never truly lived in a home before, not like this, not without fear, not without walking on invisible glass. And now, here I was, 30 years old, a captain in the United States Army, sitting in a home that finally matched the strength I had fought so hard to build. Healing did not feel like triumph. It felt like quiet, like breath, like someone had finally turned off the static that buzzed in my mind for decades. I looked around the house at the plants by the window, at the soft paint on the walls, at the framed picture of my father, and whispered, "I made it, Dad. I really did." And for the first time since he passed, I believed it. The first time my team invited me over for dinner after everything settled, I wasn't sure whether to accept. Healing had quieted the noise inside me, but stepping into spaces where people gathered as families still felt unfamiliar, like trying on shoes I wasn't sure would fit. But when First Sergeant Keller stopped by my office at the end of the duty day and said, "The guys are grilling behind the barracks. You are coming, whether you like it or not." "Mom," I found myself smiling in a way that felt almost out of place on my own face. So I went. The sun was just starting to dip behind the training fields, throwing long shadows across the asphalt when I walked up to the picnic tables behind the company area. The air smelled like charcoal and open flame mixed with the faint scent of engine oil drifting from the motor pool nearby. Soldiers stood in small clusters talking, laughing, some still wearing parts of their duty uniform, others already in PT gear. When they saw me approach, the noise changed, not softer, warmer. "Captain Hale, you made it." Someone handed me a plate before I had a chance to decline. Keller gestured me toward a seat under the big oak tree that leaned over the corner of the lot. "Sit, eat, and do not say sir when you thank me." I let out a short laugh. "Yes, First Sergeant. Good. That one you can say." The conversation flowed around me like water around a rock. The younger soldiers told stories about their first jumps. Someone recounted a malfunction during night airborne operations where a static line snapped and sent a rigger into a panic. Another told a story about a training rotation where a private accidentally saluted a civilian contractor thinking he was a general. People laughed not at the private, but at the memory, the ridiculousness, the way soldiers always found humor in chaos. As I listened, something inside me loosened. I wasn't an outsider here. I wasn't the girl who grew up in a hostile house. I wasn't the soldier with a family scandal. I was theirs, a leader, a peer, someone they respected enough to invite into their personal space. Major Branford arrived a little later carrying a bowl of potato salad and a smirk that said, "Don't comment on the fact that I cook captain." I raised both hands in mock surrender. "No judgment, ma'am." Keller leaned over. "She judges your typing, though." Branford shot him a look that could have burned through armor. He straightened immediately, pretending to be busy arranging bottles of water. The banter between them made something warm settle in my chest. It wasn't the kind of warmth that hurt. It was the kind that healed. I didn't realize how much I missed this feeling until it appeared right in front of me. Found family. Not the one you are born into, the one you build. The one built from trust and sweat and the kind of loyalty that doesn't need to be demanded because it's given freely. Halfway through the evening, a private approached me with hesitation. "Captain Hale, can I ask you something?" I nodded. He shifted nervously. "How did you stay so calm?" "With everything with your stepmom, I mean." "People would have snapped. You didn't." I took a breath before answering. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because the truth felt heavy and delicate at the same time. When you grow up in chaos, you spend your life trying to find stability. The Army taught me how to hold the line. Not just in combat, in everything. He nodded slowly like he was absorbing something he'd needed to hear for a long time. "Thank you, ma'am. It means a lot." I didn't realize until that moment how deeply the events of the past months had echoed through the battalion. Soldiers saw. Soldiers noticed. Soldiers learned from what leaders did more than what leaders said. And without meaning to, I had shown them something. The strength of restraint, the power of truth spoken quietly, the ability to stand without breaking. Later in the evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Keller lit a small fire pit near the barracks. People moved closer, forming a loose circle. Someone played soft country music from a portable speaker. A few soldiers roasted marshmallows as if we were at some makeshift campsite instead of a military installation. I sat slightly apart, leaning back on my hands, watching the fire glow across their faces. Each of them carried battles of their own, some internal, some external, but all of them showed up every day, ready to serve, ready to stand beside the person next to them. That kind of loyalty wasn't something money or blood could buy. It was forged, earned, built through shared hardship. Branford sat beside me, her posture relaxed for once. When she glanced my way, her expression was thoughtful. "You know you are not alone anymore, right?" The words hit with a quiet force I didn't expect. I looked back at the fire. "I know, ma'am," she nudged my shoulder lightly. "Good, because the Army is family. Some days better, some days louder, but always here." I huffed a soft laugh. "That is true." She tilted her head. "You ever think maybe part of healing is learning to accept when people actually care?" I didn't answer right away, not because I disagreed, but because accepting warmth after a lifetime of cold was harder than surviving the cold itself. It required unlearning instincts I had carried for years. It required trust, vulnerability, and I had never been good at either. But as I watched my soldiers laugh around the fire, I felt something settle deeper inside me. They weren't laughing at me. They weren't pitying me. They weren't waiting for me to break. They were simply including me, seeing me, welcoming me. That simple truth felt like stepping into sunlight after being underground for too long. I stayed with them until the fire burned down to embers. When I finally walked back to my car, the night air was cool and full of cricket song, the kind of Carolina stillness that always felt like a soft blanket after a long day. I paused with my hand on the door and looked back at the barracks. Warm, lit from inside, full of life, and I realized I wasn't walking away from them. I was walking toward something new, toward a life not built around surviving, but living, thriving, healing. The next weekend, they invited me again. This time I didn't hesitate. I brought a dish. I brought a chair. I brought myself without armor. And it felt good, natural, easy. One night near the end of summer after another cookout, a small group of us walked to the training field to watch the sky. Soldiers lay in the grass, staring up at scattered stars. Someone said they looked like glow points from night jumps. Someone else joked that Keller snored louder than a C-17 engine. Laughter rolled across the field. I lay back, two hands behind my head, the night cool against my skin. As I looked up at the sky, something inside me whispered a quiet truth. Your past is not your home. Your pain is not your identity. Your family is the one who shows up when you fall, the one who stays, the one who stands with you in the dark. And mine was right here, not perfect, not blood, but chosen, found, and deeply real. The kind of family that didn't demand loyalty through fear, but earned it through trust. The kind that replaced old wounds with warmth. The kind that softened the sharp edges I had carried for far too long. As the night deepened around us, I felt a peace in my chest that I had never known before. Not the fragile peace that breaks easily, a steady one, a grounded one. A peace built on truth, resilience, and connection. I whispered into the quiet air, maybe more to myself than anyone else, I am finally home. The first sign that Derek's life was beginning to unravel came through a message I didn't expect. I was finishing paperwork in my office after a battalion briefing when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It took me a moment to realize who it was. A photo appeared first blurry and shaky, showing a stack of letters and a termination notice. Then the message followed. "Rowan, it's Derek. I need to talk." Please. I stared at the phone without responding, at first feeling a complicated mixture of emotions rising in me. Bitterness, sadness, weariness. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Nothing so sharp. It was quieter, heavier, because even though Derek had spent years standing behind Linda, echoing her lies and amplifying her cruelty, there had always been a part of me that wondered if he believed the things he did or if he simply never questioned the script he grew up in. But choices were choices, and now his were circling back in ways he could no longer escape. I didn't answer the message. I just turned my phone face down and continued my work. The second message came 2 days later, this time with a voicemail. I debated whether to listen, but curiosity won out. His voice came through cracked and unstable. "Hey, Rowan, it's me. Listen, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but things are bad. Really bad. I lost my job. They said my attendance slipped too much. They said I wasn't focused. They said I was too distracted. But it wasn't my fault. It wasn't." His breath hitched. I could hear the edge of panic under the words. Then he continued rushing like he was afraid he might lose courage. "And I got served a notice. The court says I was part of the fraud. I told them I didn't know. I told them I didn't mean to. But they said ignorance doesn't protect me. They said I should have checked. They said I had a responsibility." There was a long silence before his next words fell out in a whisper. "I don't know what to do." I erased the voicemail, not out of anger, out of clarity. His collapse wasn't mine to fix. It wasn't my consequence to carry. The next week, I was on the range with my company running qualification drills when my phone buzzed again in my pocket. During a break, I checked it. Another voicemail. His voice was worse this time. "Rowan, I need help. I can't pay my rent. My landlord is threatening eviction. I can't cover the fees. I can't fix this. Please just call me back." I ended the message before it finished. Emotional undulations swept through me in a strange wave. A part of me remembered the boy he had once been, the boy who sometimes played cards with me on the porch when Linda wasn't around, the boy who sometimes looked afraid of her the way I had been. But the man he grew into had made his choices. He had stood behind her. He had mocked me. He had filmed me. He had helped smear my name online. And now he wanted me to undo all the damage he had helped create. Later that day, I was walking back to the company area when my phone rang again. This time, I answered not out of softness, but because avoiding him would only prolong something inevitable. Before I could speak, Derek's voice burst through the line, frantic and trembling. "Rowan, please, I need you. Everything is falling apart." My hands were shaking so badly earlier I dropped a glass and it shattered everywhere. I haven't slept in days. I can't eat. I can't think. I don't know what's happening to me. My voice remained steady. "Derek, what do you want? I need money. I need help with the fees. I need you to tell the court I didn't know what Mom was doing. If you tell them I didn't know, maybe they'll go easier on me. Maybe they'll let me off." My jaw tightened. "You want me to lie for you?" Just like Mom asked. No, not lie. Exactly. Just explain. Just tell them I wasn't really involved. Tell them I wasn't trying to hurt you. Tell them I didn't mean to. I took a slow breath. "Derek, you posted that I was unstable. You shared things you knew weren't true. You shoved me on the porch. You watched her hold a belt in my face. You stood there and did nothing." His breathing grew fast and panicked. I know I messed up, but I'm drowning. Please, Rowan, I'm drowning." That word stung because I knew exactly what it felt like to drown silently under someone else's control. But now he was drowning in the consequences of his own choices. Not mine. Not my responsibility. I kept my tone level. "Derek, I'm not helping you. You made your decisions. Now you live with them." He went silent for several seconds before he whispered something so small it barely carried through the line. "But we are family." The word hit harder than I expected. Family. A word that had been weaponized against me my entire life. A word Linda used to justify control. A word Derek used only when he needed something. I swallowed hard before answering. Family protects you. Family lifts you. Family tells the truth. You and Linda did none of that. He exhaled shakily. So that's it. You're done with me. Yes. He let out a quiet sob that sounded more like surrender than heartbreak. Then the line went dead. Weeks passed after that call. I heard from neighbors that Derek's situation kept spiraling. He was let go from another job before the trial even began. He stopped leaving the house except late at night to buy cheap beer or cigarettes. He started missing rent consistently. His car sat in the driveway with 2 flat tires. Mail piled up on his porch. Sometimes neighbors saw him pacing outside at 2 in the morning talking to himself. I tried not to think about him, but sometimes during long runs at PT, his face would surface in my mind, uninvited. Not out of longing, not out of regret, just human connection to a past that had twisted us both in different ways. One afternoon, the pastor from the community church called me. His voice held that gentle weight he used whenever something mattered. Captain Hale, I thought you should know. Derek checked himself into a rehabilitation program. Stress-related mental health issues and substance dependency. I didn't respond right away. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I had prepared myself for anger, for resentment, for chaos, but not for this. Is he staying voluntarily? I asked. Yes. His family is not supporting him, and he said he has nowhere else to turn. I hesitated before asking the next question. Did he ask for me? The pastor paused. He said he hopes you're doing well, but he doesn't want to bother you again. That bittersweet ache settled in my chest like slow-moving water. Relief mixed with sadness. Closure mixed with grief. Derek was finally facing the truth, but without dragging me into it. After the call, I sat on my porch at my father's house, watching the early autumn light stretch across the yard. The air smelled like pine and fading summer, the kind of scent that always made me think of endings and beginnings tangled together. I thought about Derek sitting alone in a rehab center, somewhere finally stripped of lies, but also stripped of the shield he'd always clung to. I didn't hate him. That surprised me most. I didn't forgive him. That wasn't mine to give. But I no longer carried the weight of him. His collapse was painful to witness, but it wasn't my responsibility to catch him. Bittersweet didn't even fully capture it. It was something quieter, something like standing at the edge of a cliff and watching the storm pass while knowing the damage it left behind wasn't mine to repair. I whispered softly into the cooling air around me more to myself than anyone else. You chose your path, Derek, and I chose mine, and finally the two no longer crossed. I found out about Linda's sentencing on a humid Tuesday afternoon in late September, just as our company was finishing recovery after a ruck march. I was standing near the motor pool with my hands still gripping the straps of my ruck when my phone buzzed with a message from the county clerk. The subject line was simple: sentencing results available. For a moment, I just stared at it, feeling a strange mix of tension and inevitability tightening in my chest. This was one of those moments that had lived in the back of my mind for months, not as something I hoped for, but as something that had to happen for the truth to finally settle where it belonged. When I opened the file, I expected anger or vindication or even triumph to rise up, but none of that came. Instead, I felt an almost hollow calm sweep through me as the details unfolded line by line. Linda Hale, guilty of fraud, forged signatures, and attempted property seizure. Sentence: 18 months suspended time. Mandatory community service financial restitution and partial asset seizure. The words looked clinical on the screen, almost too clean for the chaos she had created, but beneath the sterile legal language I could see the reality forming sharp and unavoidable. Linda wasn't going to prison, but she was going to lose every ounce of power she had built her identity around. It was strange how quiet justice could be. No dramatic shouting. No triumphant music, just a digital document and the slow exhale of something finally ending. I closed the file and walked back toward the company area. Soldiers were laughing, wiping sweat from their faces, complaining about blisters and heat. Life kept moving even while something monumental shifted inside me. Later that evening, I drove past the neighborhood where Linda still lived. I didn't intend to stop. I wasn't there to gloat. I wasn't even sure why I went. Maybe I needed to see closure with my own eyes. Maybe part of me needed to understand that the woman who had shaped so much of my pain was now simply another person living with the consequences of her actions. As I turned onto the street, the first thing I noticed was the for sale sign planted crookedly in her overgrown yard. The grass was knee-high in places, and patches of dirt showed where weeds had choked the soil. The shutters hung unevenly, paint peeling. The porch light was broken. The house looked tired, abandoned, even though someone still lived inside. And then I saw her. Linda was standing on the porch steps wearing a loose sweater that hung too big on her frame. Her hair was no longer styled the way she used to obsess over. Her posture had none of the false confidence that once made neighbors believe she was some upstanding pillar of the community. She looked small, diminished, a shadow of the woman who once controlled every inch of that house. When she noticed my car rolling slowly down the street, her body froze. For a moment, she didn't move at all. Then she stepped forward slightly as if unsure whether she should wave or turn away. I didn't stop. I didn't roll down the window. I didn't acknowledge her. I simply kept driving until her figure disappeared in the rearview mirror. Something ached inside my chest, not with longing or regret, but with the weight of finality. The next morning, I read reports in the local paper about her sentence. The comments section from the neighborhood group was brutal in a way I had never expected. People who once sang her praises now wrote long paragraphs about how they had always suspected something was off. Others called her manipulative. Some talked about the way she created drama, how she lied, how she manipulated people who trusted her. Even the ones who used to admire her tone turned sharp. They had turned their backs on her the same way she once taught them to turn their backs on me. A sick twist of irony settled in my stomach as I read. Community service began the following week. Every morning at 7, she was required to report to the municipal center to clean public spaces, organize storage areas, and assist custodial staff. Pictures circulated online of her wearing an orange vest picking up trash along the sidewalk. I didn't save the pictures, but I saw them. Everyone did. A neighbor told me she rarely spoke to anyone anymore. She kept her head down. She avoided eye contact. The arrogance had been replaced with something that looked almost like fear. The partial asset seizure hit next. The court stripped her of the financial accounts she had funneled from my father's estate. They seized the home equity she had taken without permission. The mortgage she couldn't afford became her responsibility alone. She tried to appeal, but the judge denied her request within minutes. And then she faced the consequence that hurt her more deeply than all the legal penalties combined. The community stopped trusting her. Trust was the currency she once lived on, the thing she used to manipulate everyone around her. Without it, she had nothing. The woman who used to host neighborhood gatherings now sat alone behind closed blinds. People who once visited her no longer walked past the house. Children avoided her yard. No one waved from their porches. One neighbor wrote online that when Linda approached her in a grocery store to ask if she could borrow money for repairs, she simply turned and walked away. Others told similar stories. She had become exactly what she always accused me of being: a stray, a burden, a problem no one wanted to claim. There was a moment about 3 weeks into her community service where I saw her again, completely by accident. I had stopped at a gas station near Bragg Boulevard after a company meeting when I saw her through the glass window. She was inside wearing the same faded sweater, her face drawn and tired. She looked older, not slightly, dramatically, as if the weight of everything had carved lines into her features overnight. She was counting coins on the counter, her hands trembling slightly. When she realized she didn't have enough, she closed her eyes for a moment, swallowed hard, and whispered something to the cashier. I couldn't hear it, but her expression told me everything. I walked back to my truck with an unexpected heaviness inside me. Her downfall wasn't satisfying. It didn't taste like victory. It tasted like truth. Raw, cold, unpolished. Justice wasn't theatrics. It was reality settling in. And reality had stripped Linda of everything she once used to dominate others. By late October, the eviction notice went up. She couldn't keep the house. The same porch where she once stood towering over me with cruelty was now a place she avoided. She packed boxes slowly, sometimes sitting for long stretches on the steps, as if unable to comprehend how her world had collapsed so completely. A neighbor later told me she was moving to a small apartment on the edge of town. Alone. No Derek, no friends, no reputation, no money, no power. When I heard that, I sat on my own porch that evening staring at the fading Carolina sky. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the backyard. I wrapped my hands around a mug of tea and let myself breathe deeply. It wasn't joy I felt. It wasn't spite or triumph. It was something quieter, something deeper. Closure. I whispered into the stillness around me, almost without meaning to. You made your choices, Linda, and now they belong to you. And for the first time in my entire life, the story between us finally felt finished. Peace did not arrive in my life like a celebration or a bright morning where everything suddenly felt different. It came quietly, gradually, like soft light slipping under a door before sunrise. In the weeks after Linda's sentencing and Derek's disappearance into rehab, the noise that had once filled every shadow of my mind finally began to fade. I didn't realize how heavy it had been until it started lifting. At first, I half expected chaos to return, as if my body had been conditioned to brace for impact, but nothing came. No late-night messages, no threats, no accusations. Only silence. A silence that grew larger each day until I realized it was not emptiness. It was space. Space for myself. Space to breathe. Space to build something that belonged entirely to me. Life at Fort Liberty returned to its usual rhythm, the kind of rhythm that felt steady and grounding. Morning PT still kicked off before sunrise, the smell of damp grass clinging to the air as we ran across the parade field. My soldiers still teased each other when someone lagged behind. Keller still yelled at privates who forgot their hydration packs. Major Branford still walked with that purposeful stride that made people straighten automatically when she passed. But something inside me had shifted. I moved through my days without the quiet tension that had once lived beneath my ribs. The work didn't change. I did. After duty hours, I found myself spending more time at my father's house, the place that had once felt like a battlefield of old memories. Now it was slowly becoming home. I ripped out the last of the overgrown shrubs near the window and planted small clusters of lavender and rosemary in their place. Their scent drifted through the yard at dusk, calming in a way I had never expected plants to be. I fixed the broken porch railing and replaced the warped boards on the steps. I scrubbed the grime from the siding, repainted the trim, and restored the front door to the deep oak color it had when my father first bought the house. Each improvement felt like reclaiming something piece by piece, not just the house myself. One morning, while sweeping leaves off the porch, I found an old dog bowl tucked underneath the steps. I had forgotten it existed. My father used to feed a stray dog that wandered through our yard every few evenings. He always said some creatures find their way home when the world gives them nowhere else to go. The memory warmed something inside me. On impulse, I bought a new dog bowl that afternoon. Then I visited the shelter on Bragg Boulevard and adopted a small, anxious husky mix with mismatched eyes and a timid gait. I named her Kai. The shelter worker said she struggled with trust and loud noises. I smiled because in a way she reminded me of myself. She followed me around the house at first, like she wasn't sure she belonged. She slept curled at the foot of my bed, lifting her head whenever I shifted, as if checking whether I would disappear. But slowly she settled. Slowly she trusted. The first time she ran freely across the backyard with her tail high and her ears perked something unclenched in my chest. Watching her heel felt like watching my own reflection learning how to breathe again. My routine changed in small ways that added up. Instead of finishing work and collapsing into exhaustion, I started taking evening walks with Kai along the tree line behind the housing area. The sunsets were different each day, sometimes pink, sometimes gold, sometimes dark and dramatic, like long brushstrokes across the sky. Soldiers often jogged past, waving, shouting greetings. Families walked with kids on scooters. The world felt gentle in a way I had never let myself experience before. One Saturday morning, I wandered into a local greenhouse just to browse and walked out with armfuls of seedlings and bags of soil. I spent hours planting them around the yard, arranging colors and textures until everything felt balanced. Gardening became its own form of therapy. The quiet sounds of soil shifting under my hands, the steady rhythm of watering, the satisfaction of watching new growth stretch toward the sun. It reminded me that healing was not loud or dramatic. It was steady, incremental, earned. Around late October, Keller stopped by unexpectedly with a toolbox and a look that said, "Don't argue with me, ma'am." He spent 3 hours helping me replace the loose gutters and patch a small leak on the roof. When I tried to pay him, he pushed my hand away. "No, ma'am. This is just what family does." Branford visited next. She brought a ceramic pot with a small ficus inside and said plants are known for improving the emotional climate. I raised an eyebrow and she quickly added, "Not that you need emotional improvement, Captain, just that the house should match the new chapter you are building." I laughed harder than I had in a long time. My home filled slowly with these touches, not extravagant things, just meaningful ones. A framed photo my soldiers gifted me of the entire company after airborne training, a quilt one of the spouses made with patches from different brigades, a mug from Keller that said "Best Captain but absolutely terrible at karaoke." Evenings became quieter in the best way. Sometimes I sat on the back porch with Kai, resting her head on my knee while crickets sang and the air cooled around us. Sometimes I read. Sometimes I played soft music. Sometimes I simply existed in silence without fear or tension, without expecting the next blow, without bracing for someone to tear me down. One night, I sat with a cup of tea watching the garden lights glow across the yard and felt an overwhelming gratitude rise through me, not for what I endured. No, but for what I became despite it, for the strength it took to confront the past, for the resilience to stand firm against lies, for the courage to expose the truth publicly even when it meant tearing open old wounds, and for the peace that followed, a peace I had fought for, a peace I had earned, a peace I protected. I whispered softly into the night as Kai lifted her head like she was listening. "Thank you. Not to anyone else, not to the world, to myself. Thank you for standing up. Thank you for fighting back. Thank you for choosing truth. Thank you for surviving long enough to build something better." And in that moment, I realized something that settled so deeply inside me, it felt like the closing of a long, painful chapter. I was no longer living in reaction to my past. I was living in creation of my future. And I was finally free. I drove back to my old childhood street on a crisp November afternoon when the air held that faint bite of winter and the sky stretched pale blue over the tops of the pines lining the neighborhood. It had been months since I last set foot near the house, where so much of my life had been shaped, scarred, and ultimately reclaimed. I wasn't there out of nostalgia or sentimentality. I wasn't there to reopen old wounds or to relive the past. I was there because closure isn't something you simply declare. It is something you stand in front of, breathe through, acknowledge fully, and then quietly walk beyond. As I turned into the driveway, the gravel crunched beneath the tires in a sound that once filled me with dread. This time, it only felt familiar, like a distant echo of a life I no longer belonged to. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The siding still bore the stains of neglect, though the worst of the deterioration had been addressed since the court transferred ownership to me. The front porch was swept clean, the weeds pulled from the steps, the windows wiped of dust. Still, a thin film of dirt clung to the wooden frame, evidence of years spent under someone else's bitterness. I stepped out of the truck and paused for a long moment, letting the cold air brush against my face as memories flickered quietly in the back of my mind. The porch where Linda once towered over me with a belt in hand. The doorway where Derek smirked as if cruelty were some kind of sport. The hallway where I learned to move quietly so no one would notice me. The living room where I realized I would leave one day and never look back. Yet here I was, not as a frightened girl, not as a scapegoat, not as a target of cruelty, but as the rightful heir, the legal owner, the one who had survived. I walked slowly toward the steps and the boards creaked with the same tired sound I remembered, only now they no longer felt threatening. They were just wood. Aging wood. Nothing more. Nothing less. My boots left small marks in the layer of dust coating the top step. When I reached the door, I reached for the handle without fully knowing why. It didn't turn. Locked. Of course it was locked. Linda had returned the keys through her attorney before she moved into her apartment on the far edge of town, a place where no one knew her, no one trusted her, and no one cared for the stories she once used to manipulate an entire community. I stood there for a few seconds listening to the silence that wrapped around the house. It was a heavy silence, but not oppressive. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm finally empties itself of rain and thunder. I stepped back and my gaze moved to the wooden sign hanging to the right of the doorway. The Hail Home. The letters were carved deep into the wood, the edges worn from years of weather and heat. When I was a child, I used to run my fingers along those grooves, tracing the letters over and over, as if trying to reassure myself that I belonged to something. For years, that sign felt like a lie, a symbol of a home that was never gentle, never safe, never warm. But now, the house belonged to me, not as a reminder of pain, as a blank page. Slowly, I lifted my hand and placed my palm against the wooden sign. It felt cool and rough under my skin, textured like a life that had been weathered, but endured. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the memories come not to haunt me, but to be acknowledged. The shouting, the humiliation, the manipulation, the loneliness. The nights I cried silently into my pillow so no one would hear. The mornings I forced myself to get up because hope was a stubborn thing, even in the darkest places. And then I let the memories go. Not erased, not forgotten. Set down, released. They no longer owned me. They no longer controlled me. They were chapters in a story that had already turned its pages. When I opened my eyes, I felt a steady warmth in my chest. Not joy exactly, not triumph, something more grounded, a sense of truth settling into place, a sense of completion, a sense of peace that had been earned slowly, painfully through choices I made to stand, to fight, to expose the truth, and to choose myself over the lies that once shaped my world. I stepped away from the sign and looked out across the yard. Sunlight filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows across the grass. A soft breeze moved through the branches, stirring the quiet in a way that felt almost like a whisper. I realized then that I didn't need to go inside. I didn't need to walk those rooms again or revisit the ghosts of my past. I didn't need to retell the story one more time. The story was finished. The justice had already been done. Not loudly, not with spectacle, not with vengeance, but with truth, with patience, with courage, with steadiness. As I walked back toward my truck, Kai poked her head out the open window. Her ears perked as if sensing the shift in my heartbeat. I scratched behind her ears before climbing into the driver's seat. As I looked up at this house one last time, I felt no resentment, no fear, no desire to hold on. Only gratitude for how far I had come and certainty for who I had become. I rested my hand briefly on the steering wheel and whispered the final truth aloud, letting it settle into the quiet that surrounded the house and the life I once lived inside it. Justice isn't loud, it's steady. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, then maybe you felt some part of it sit deeper than you expected. Maybe you recognized a moment, a voice, a pattern, or a pain that looked a little too familiar. Stories like mine carry pieces of so many people across the country, especially those who grew up in complicated homes or spent years trying to rebuild themselves after being torn down. And if you are here right now listening to the final quiet moment of this journey, then I want to ask you something simple and personal because your story matters too. Where are you watching from? What state holds your memories, your roots, your battles, your victories? I always ask this question because every answer paints a map of people who have lived through storms of their own. Maybe you are in a peaceful little town tucked between rolling hills. Maybe you are in a crowded city where the traffic never sleeps. Maybe you are on a quiet street that looks nothing like the one I grew up on. Maybe you are somewhere far from where you started, or maybe you are right where your childhood began. Wherever you are, your voice matters here. And I want to know it. I want to know your state because each answer turns the comment section into a place where strangers become a kind of long-distance community sharing stories across thousands of miles. You never know who might read your comment and think I needed that. And beyond that, I want to ask another question, even more important one that touches the heart of this entire journey. What would you have done if you were standing on that porch? If someone screamed in your face words meant to break your dignity, if someone tried to erase your place in your own family, if someone tried to steal your inheritance, your worth, your voice, if someone tried to bury you under lies and shame, would you have confronted them? Would you have walked away? Would you have fought back quietly or loudly, or not at all? There is no single correct answer because everyone carries different scars, different histories, different capacities to endure and to rise. But sharing your answer, especially at the end of a story like this, it might help someone who is right now standing in their own version of that moment. Someone watching from their living room, or their truck in a parking lot, or a quiet bedroom with the lights off might be facing a choice they never asked for. And your perspective could be the moment they finally understand they are not alone. When people share where they are watching from, the comments suddenly fill with voices from every corner of America. People from North Carolina saying they recognize the small towns and cracked sidewalks. People from Texas sharing stories about family fights that lasted decades. People from California talking about starting over. People from Ohio or Arizona or Florida or New York saying this story hit too close to home. But then something else happens. They start telling what they would have done. Some say they would have walked away because peace matters more than war. Some say they would have stood their ground because dignity is worth defending. Some say they wish they had been brave enough to do in their own past what the main character did in this story. And some say they finally feel ready to make a choice for themselves. That is why I ask. That is why this question returns in every story. Not for engagement, not for metrics, but because stories like this are not just entertainment. They are echoes of real lives, real battles, real victories, big and small. When you share your state and what you would have done, you are adding your chapter to a long line of people who rebuilt themselves from the ground up. People who found peace after pain. People who understood that justice does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it arrives slowly like dawn after a long night. So I invite you now gently and honestly to share your place in the world. Tell me your state. Tell me the ground beneath your feet, the sky above your home, the place you drink your morning coffee or watch the sunset after a long day. And then tell me what you would have done. Would you have walked away sooner? Would you have confronted the people who broke you? Would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Would you have spoken up to break it? Would you have chosen forgiveness or distance or strength or patience? Every answer is welcome here because every answer belongs to someone who is still writing their own story. I ask not for judgment, but for connection. For the simple human truth that we all have lived through something that shaped us, and we all deserve a place where our voice can land softly without fear. Maybe your comment will reach someone in a different state, someone who needed to know they are not the only person who survived a home that wasn't truly a home. Maybe your comment will remind someone that leaving is possible, healing is real, and starting over is not a weakness. Maybe your comment will echo into another story, another viewer, another life. And maybe sharing your voice will also be a small act of healing for yourself. You listened to my journey all the way to the end, and now I want to hear a piece of yours. So tell me where you are watching from. Tell me the state whose roads you know by heart. And tell me what you would have done if you stood where I stood. Your voice matters more than you think. Your story matters more than you know. And somewhere out there, someone needs to hear exactly what you choose to share. I am listening. The community is listening. And this is your moment to speak. So go ahead. Where are you watching from? Tell me your state and what you would have done.